He pulled the trigger before the American even finished screaming for cover. The bullet didn't miss. It never missed. 3 U.S. Navy SEALs were already down, pinned behind rocks soaked in their own blood, and the enemy sniper commander actually laughed into the cold mountain air because he knew no one was coming. No one could stop him. That's what everyone believed, everyone except one person. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that mountain. The call came in at 0217 hours. Not through the normal channels, not through the clean, professional lines of communication that made operations feel organized and controlled. This one came in broken, desperate, the kind of transmission that made experienced men close their eyes for just a second before they answered. Alpha Actual to any station. We are pinned. Repeat, we are pinned. 3 men down. We cannot move. We cannot move. Someone tell me there is a QRF en route because we are static. Then a different voice. Younger, shakier. This is Alpha 2-6. Petty Officer Reyes is hit bad. We are taking accurate fire from at least 3 positions. We have tried to break contact twice, and both times we got cut apart. Someone is watching us. Someone knows where we're going before we go there. Chief Warrant Officer Dennis Holt sat in the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, at a forward operating base that most maps didn't bother to name, and he listened to every single word coming through that radio with the kind of stillness that only came from 22 years of doing exactly this kind of work. He had heard desperate transmissions before. He had heard men scream, men cry, men say things into a radio that they would never repeat in a quiet room. He knew the difference between a team that was scared and a team that was finished. Alpha Platoon was not finished, but they were close. How many snipers are we talking about? Holt asked the intelligence officer standing beside him. Captain Marcus Webb looked at the terrain map spread across the table. His finger traced the ridge lines east of the valley where Alpha Platoon had inserted 6 hours earlier. The mission was supposed to be clean. 40 minutes in, extract the asset, 40 minutes out. Simple. The kind of operation that got filed under routine in the after-action reports. Based on the angles of the incoming fire and the positions the platoon reported before they went dark, Webb said slowly, I count 3, maybe 4. But these aren't just local fighters with old rifles sitting on a hill. The spacing between their positions, the way they've coordinated the suppression, this is trained. This is disciplined. Taliban. Could be. Could also be something else. Webb paused. Whoever they are, they've been watching that valley for a while. They knew exactly where Alpha was going to move. Holt pressed the transmit button. Alpha Actual, this is TOC. We hear you. Stay put. Do not attempt to move. We are working the problem. The response came back immediately, and it was not from the platoon commander. It was from Petty Officer First Class Torres, the platoon's senior medic. And his voice had that particular quality that Holt had learned to recognize over 2 decades, the voice of a man who was still doing his job while everything around him fell apart. Toshi, I need you to understand something. I have 3 wounded. Reyes took a round through the upper thigh and I am losing him. Not slowly, I am losing him right now. Whatever you are working on, please work faster. Holt looked at Webb. Webb looked at the map. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that getting any kind of air asset over that ridgeline in the next 20 minutes was probably not going to happen. The weather had closed in 2 hours ago. Ceiling was low, the kind of low that made pilots shake their heads and stare at their instruments and politely explain that they wanted to help, but they also wanted to live. What about Carter? Holt said. Webb's head came up. She's on the eastern ridge. She's been up there since yesterday for the Ramadi Overwatch tasking that got scrubbed. So she's already in position. She's 3 kilometers from Alpha's location, across some very unfriendly terrain in the dark. Or, Holt said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had just thought of something, she can work from where she is. Webb stared at him. Dennis, the distances involved. Get her on the radio. There was a moment, one of those moments where the air in a room changes because everyone in it simultaneously understands that something important is about to happen. The radio operator, a young petty officer named Garza, who had been silent through all of this, doing his job, keeping his head down, reached for the frequency dial without being asked. Whiskey 1, this is TOC, come in. The response was immediate, and it was quiet. Not the quiet of static, the quiet of someone who had been awake for hours in a cold mountain hide, watching and listening and waiting, and who had heard everything that was happening on the adjacent frequency and was already thinking 3 moves ahead. TOC, this is Whiskey 1. I've been monitoring Alpha's traffic. Send it. Lieutenant Emily Carter's voice was the kind of calm that wasn't performed. It wasn't the forced steadiness of someone trying to sound unafraid. It was the calm of someone who had spent so many hours in impossible situations that impossible had simply stopped meaning what it used to mean. She was 29 years old. She had been a SEAL for 4 years. She had more confirmed sniper kills than half the men in her community, and she never once brought that up in conversation because it had nothing to do with anything she actually cared about. What she cared about was the team on that radio, the team that was bleeding and pinned and running out of time. Emily Mile, Holt said, dropping the call signs for just a second because sometimes the moment required it. What's your current position relative to the ridgeline where Alpha is taking fire? A pause. She was checking something, looking through her scope probably, doing the math in her head that other people needed calculators and rangefinders in committee discussions to do. 3.2 kilometers to the first known firing position, 3.8 to what I'm estimating is position 2 based on the suppression pattern I've been hearing. The third one, another pause shorter. The third one is mobile, Sust. He's been moving. I've been trying to get a read on him for the last 40 minutes. Can you work those distances? In this wind? In this light? She didn't say yes immediately, and that was actually the thing that made Holt trust her answer when it came, because people who said yes immediately to questions like that were lying to themselves. Give me 3 minutes to confirm what I think I know about position 1. After that, yeah, I can work it. Webb was already shaking his head beside Holt, not disagreeing, more like a man watching someone attempt something that violated several laws of physics simultaneously and trying to decide whether to be horrified or amazed. 3 minutes, Holt said into the radio. Alpha Platoon TOC, sit tight. Help is closer than you think. On the other end of that transmission, in the rocks, in the cold, in the blood, in the dark, Lieutenant Commander James Okafor Alpha, actual the platoon commander, a man with 17 years in the teams, in 4 combat deployments, in a collection of scars that told a story he never volunteered. Heard those words and felt something he would later admit he hadn't felt in a very long time. He didn't feel relief, not yet. He felt the very small, very careful beginning of something that might, if everything went exactly right, eventually to become hope. But right now he had more immediate problems. Torres. His voice was low, controlled. The voice he used when he needed his people to match his energy. Talk to me about Reyes. Torres was pressed against a boulder 6 feet away, both hands working his kit spread around him in the organized chaos of battlefield medicine. Tourniquet is on. Pack the wound. He's stable for now, but I need to get him out. He needs surgery, boss. Not in an hour, soon. Copy. Okafor keyed his radio. 2-6, this is actual. What's the status on Garza and Mendez? Petty Officer 2nd Class Aaron Webb. No relation to the intelligence captain at the TOC, came back on the radio from his position 20 meters further up the slope. His voice was tight, controlled. The control of a man holding himself together through sheer professional stubbornness. Garza's got a graze on his left arm. He's still up. Mendez took one in the plate. Plate stopped it, but he's got cracked ribs at minimum, and he's having trouble breathing. I'm watching him. And the fire. It stopped. About 3 minutes ago, it just stopped. They're not shooting anymore. Okafor processed that. An enemy that stopped shooting was either repositioning or reloading, and this was the option that made his stomach tighten, waiting for the Americans to think the threat was gone. Waiting for someone to stand up to move to give them a target. Nobody moves, Okafor said. Not an inch. Everyone stays exactly where they are. Boss, it was Petty Officer Daniels from the far left of their hasty position, and his voice had a particular edge that Okafor recognized. Daniels was the kind of man who noticed things, small things, the kind of things that turned out to matter enormously. You hear that? Okafor listened. Birds. There were birds moving in the rocks above and to the northeast. Not flying away, moving, disturbed, like something had passed through them. They're repositioning, Okafor said quietly. Not into the radio, mostly to himself. Then into the radio, everyone pull in, tighten up. They're moving. On her ridgeline 3 kilometers away, Emily Carter heard those same words through her earpiece and simultaneously noticed the same thing through her scope that Okafor had noticed with his ears. A shadow, not a big one, not obvious. The kind of shadow that existed in a space where there shouldn't have been a shadow because the ambient light was coming from the wrong angle to produce it naturally. She had been lying absolutely still for the last 40 minutes. Her breathing was slow and even and deliberate. Her world had narrowed down to what she could see through the glass, and in that narrowed world, she was the most patient creature alive. She had learned patience not from any instructor, though she'd had good ones, but from a kind of internal reckoning she'd done early in her career about what this work actually required. It required you to be more still than the mountain. It required you to care enough about the outcome that you refused to hurry. It required you to understand that the most important shot you would ever take was always the next one. The shadow moved, just slightly, maybe 8 inches. Enough. Emily didn't rush. She made 3 small adjustments: elevation, windage, the almost imperceptible shift of her body that zeroed out a variable she'd been tracking for the last 10 minutes. She breathed out, halfway, held it. In the TOC, Holt was watching the clock. 2 minutes and 40 seconds had passed since he told Emily 3 minutes. He wasn't going to rush her. He knew better than to rush her. But he was watching that clock the way you watch something when you know the number means something. At the 2-minute, 52-second mark, a single shot cracked across the mountains. In the TOC, no one spoke. On the radio from Alpha's position, after a silence of maybe 4 full seconds, Okafor's voice came through. Position 1 just went quiet. I mean completely quiet. Someone tell me that was Carter. That was Carter, Holt said, and despite everything, despite 22 years of professional composure, he let himself smile for exactly 1 second. But Emily wasn't smiling. Emily was already moving her scope, already tracking, already thinking about position 2, about the thermal camouflage she'd caught a glimpse of twice in the last 30 minutes, about the way the wind had shifted in the last 4 minutes and what that meant for her next calculation. She keyed her radio briefly. 1 down, working 2, keep Alpha still. Copy, Emily. And tell Torres to keep pressure on that tourniquet. Reyes loses that leg if he doesn't. Holt blinked. He hadn't told her about Reyes. She had pieced it together from the radio traffic, from Torres's tone of voice, from whatever processing she did that was so fast and so layered that it happened below the level of conscious thought. We'll pass it along, he said. Torres, when he received the message, looked up from his patient for exactly 1 second. He didn't know Carter. He'd never worked with her. But in that moment, in the middle of everything, hearing that she had noticed that she knew that she was thinking about Reyes from 3 kilometers away in the dark, Torres felt something crack open in his chest. Not grief, something that was almost its opposite. Tell her thank you, Torres said into the radio. Tell her I've got him. On the platoon net, Daniels, the one who noticed things, said quietly to no one in particular, "Who is this woman?" Okafor didn't answer. He was counting, not seconds. He was counting the angles, trying to figure out where position 2 was based on where position 1 had been, trying to think the way the enemy was thinking, trying to anticipate the next move. They know, he said suddenly. Position 2 knows that position 1 is gone. Listen. And they listened and they heard it. Movement. Not close, but purposeful. Something changing in the arrangement of the battlefield. 2-6, you still have eyes on the northeast approach. Negative, I lost visual about 2 minutes ago when the light shifted. Daniels, I've got movement. Upper slope, maybe 200 meters. They're not coming down. I think they're moving laterally. Okafor's mind ran through it fast. A sniper losing their primary position. Moving laterally rather than retreating, not running, repositioning, a professional repositioning. He keyed the radio to the TOC frequency. TOC Alpha, actual. We have movement on position 2. They know 1 is down. They're adjusting. In the TOC, Holt relayed this to Emily in the fewest possible words. Emily didn't respond verbally. She was already looking at where she'd expect someone to move if they were trained and disciplined and had just lost a teammate and needed a new angle. And needed it fast. She looked at the 3 places she would go. Then she looked at the 1 place she would go if she was very good and very calm and understood that the obvious choices were the ones that got you killed. She found the thermal signature 6 seconds later. It wasn't much, a faint irregularity in the rock face, the kind of thing that thermal camouflage was specifically designed to prevent, and it almost worked. Almost. But thermal camouflage operated on averages, and nature didn't work on averages, and Emily had been looking at that hillside long enough to know what average looked like. This wasn't average. She made her adjustments. The wind was worse now, gusting from the northwest in a pattern that was almost random. Almost. She tracked it. She waited for the pattern she had identified in the last 20 minutes to repeat itself. It did. She had a window of approximately 4 seconds. She used 3 of them. The second shot was the one that people would talk about afterward. Not because of the distance, which was extraordinary. Not because of the wind conditions, which were brutal. But because of what it represented, the decision to take a shot that most snipers would have categorized as too risky, too uncertain, too likely to miss, and give away position, and to make that decision not from recklessness, but from a precise, clear-eyed calculation that the probability of success was sufficient and the cost of inaction was not acceptable. In the rocks below, Alpha Platoon heard the second shot. Then they heard nothing from position 2. Then Torres said very quietly, "Reyes is stable. His pressure is coming up." And Daniel said, "2 down." And somewhere in the middle of all of that, Petty Officer Aaron Webb, who had been pressed against a rock for 4 hours with cracked ribs, and a teammate bleeding beside him, and a darkness he couldn't see through, and an enemy he couldn't locate. Webb said something that none of them ever let him forget. He said, "I think I love her." Okafor almost laughed, almost. Instead, he keyed the radio one more time. "TOC, what's the status on the 3rd position? We still have one out there." In the TOC, Holt looked at the radio. He looked at the map. He looked at Webb. Captain Webb, not Petty Officer Webb, who was staring at the terrain with an expression that had shifted from analytical to something closer to concerned. "What is it?" Holt asked. "The 3rd position," Webb said slowly. "I've been trying to reconstruct it from the suppression patterns," Alpha reported. "The angles don't fit. They don't fit for a static position." He paused. "He's been moving this whole time. He's never stopped moving. Every shot he's taken has been from a different location." Holt stared at him. "That's not a sniper," Holt said. "That's a sniper commander." Webb nodded. "And now he knows," Holt said, "that both of his people are down, which means right now he is either retreating or he's hunting," Webb said. They both looked at the radio. Emily's voice came through before either of them could transmit. "I know," she said simply. "I'm already looking." She was already looking. But looking was different now. Looking now meant that somewhere in those mountains, there was a man who was better than the 2 men she had just killed, and he knew she was out there, and he was trying to find her the same way she was trying to find him. The battlefield had changed completely in the span of 40 seconds. It wasn't Alpha Platoon versus 3 anonymous snipers anymore. It was Emily Carter versus one very skilled, very motivated, very dangerous man who had just watched 2 of his people disappear and understood exactly what that meant. It meant he was alone. And some men, when they became alone, became reckless. But some men, when they became alone, became something else entirely. Emily pressed herself lower against the rock and kept watching, kept breathing, kept waiting, and in the back of her mind, not the front, never the front, where it could interfere with the work, she felt the first faint edge of something she hadn't felt yet on this particular night. Not fear, caution. The kind of caution that told you that what was coming next was going to require everything you had and possibly more. She had 2 people alive who needed her to be right. She had 3 people alive who needed her to be better than the man hunting her. She had a platoon of Americans sitting in the dark bleeding and holding on who needed her to do something that she had never yet done in 4 years of some of the hardest combat any SEAL had ever seen. She needed to win a duel, and she needed to do it before the man on the other side of it figured out exactly where she was. She breathed out. She watched. She waited. The mountain waited with her. The mountain had gone silent in the way that only mountains in combat go silent. Not peaceful, not empty, but loaded, coiled. The kind of silence that had weight to it that pressed down on your chest and made every breath feel like a decision. Alpha Platoon hadn't moved. Okafor had given the order 20 minutes ago, and no one had questioned it. Not because they were afraid to question him. These were SEALs. Questioning the order was part of the culture, part of what made them good. But because every single one of them understood instinctively the way you understood things after years of doing this work, that the man still out there was different. The first two had been professionals. This one was something else. Boss, Daniels again, always Daniels. Movement stopped. I've got nothing on the northeast slope. That doesn't mean he's gone, Okafor said. I know. It means he moved somewhere we can't see. Daniels didn't respond to that because there was nothing to say to it that would make it better. Torres had Reyes stabilize both of them, tucked behind the largest boulder in their immediate position. Reyes drifting in and out of a pain-managed half-consciousness that Torres was monitoring with the precise attention of a man who knew exactly how thin the margin was. Mendez was breathing harder than Torres wanted, but was still functional, still watching his sector, still doing his job the way SEALs did their jobs, even when every breath felt like someone was tightening a vice around their ribs. Aaron Webb 26 had moved 2 meters to his left in the last 10 minutes, slowly, carefully, an inch at a time, trying to find a better angle on the approach he'd lost visual on. He hadn't asked permission. Okafor had seen it happening and hadn't stopped him because Webb's instincts were good, and because Okafor understood that a good operator needed room to make small decisions without a radio call for every one of them. The radio crackled. Alpha Actual, this is Whiskey 1, Emily's voice. Okafor felt everyone in the immediate vicinity go a little more still. It was remarkable the effect she'd had on the platoon in the space of 40 minutes. 2 shots, 2 results, a woman none of them had ever worked with 3 kilometers away in the dark, and somehow she had become the thing they were all oriented toward. The fixed point. Send it, Whiskey 1. Your third contact has gone to ground. He's not retreating. I want you to understand that clearly. He is not leaving. He's waiting for one of your people to move. Copy. We're not moving. Good, I need something from you. Okafor paused. Name it. I need a distraction. Small. Controlled. I need him to think someone is breaking position just for 2 or 3 seconds. I need him to shift. Can you give me that? The pause on Okafor's end was not hesitation. It was calculation, the kind of fast layered calculation that separated a good officer from an average one. He was thinking about who he could use, what the risk was, how much exposure was acceptable, whether there was a safer version of what she was asking. He landed on an answer in about 4 seconds. Daniels, he said on the platoon net. Yeah, boss. I'm going to need you to do something stupid on purpose. Daniels actually laughed. It was a short laugh, barely a sound, the laugh of a man who found a certain dark humor in the situation. My specialty. What do you need? On my mark, throw your helmet, high, south side of your position, then get down and stay down. A beat. Just my helmet. Just your helmet. Copy that. Standing by. Okafor keyed the TOC frequency. Whiskey 1, we're ready. Give me a countdown. In the TOC, Holt was leaning over Garza's shoulder, both of them listening to the exchange. Captain Webb had a topographical readout open on the screen beside him and was running numbers trying to predict the geometry of what Emily was setting up. He kept shaking his head, not in disbelief, but in the way you shake your head when someone shows you a solution that's elegant and terrifying at the same time. She's using them as bait, Webb said quietly. She's using them as a trigger, Holt corrected. There's a difference. Emily's voice came back on. Mark in 15 seconds, 10, EMA mark. Daniels threw the helmet. It arced up over the south side of his position, black against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, tumbling, catching a fraction of the ambient light. The shot came from the west, not the northeast. The west. Emily had anticipated it. She had already moved her scope 14 degrees. Left already been watching the western approach. Already understood something about this man's pattern that no one else had seen yet because no one else had been watching long enough and carefully enough to see it. The enemy's shot hit the helmet mid-arc and sent it spinning. Emily fired her shot in the same half second. She hit him. She knew she hit him because the follow-up shot that should have come the second shot that a trained sniper always had, ready, always prepared, the instinctive response to a confirmed kill never came. But she also knew immediately with a certainty that came from the quality of the hit rather than its result that she had not killed him. She had wounded him. And a wounded sniper commander who knew where you were was more dangerous than 3 healthy ones who didn't. TOC Whiskey 1, I have a probable hit on target 3. He is down but not eliminated. I need Alpha to stay put. Do not move. He is still functional. In the rocks, Okafor heard this and felt the platoon around him go from cautious to very cautious. There was a specific quality to the kind of fear that came from knowing your enemy was hurt. And still out there, it was different from the fear of not knowing where he was. Knowing he was wounded meant knowing he had nothing left to lose. Wounded animals, wounded men, wounded commanders, they all operated on the same calculus when they reached a certain threshold. They stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about taking someone with them. Torres, Okafor said quietly. How's Reyes? Same, stable, but I need to move him within the hour. Understood. Aaron Webb's voice cut in, and for the first time all night, his voice had something in it that wasn't controlled. Boss, I've got blood trail. On the western approach. He's moving. Everyone heard that. Okafor processed it in 2 seconds. Moving meant mobile. Mobile. Mobile meant he hadn't taken a center mass hit. A hit to an extremity maybe. An arm. A leg. Painful. Degrading but not stopping him. Direction north. Moving north along the base of the ridgeline. North. Okafor looked at his mental map. North along the base of the ridgeline from the western approach, put the enemy moving toward. He's circling, Okafor said. He's trying to get around to the north side. He wants to flank us. Or, Webb said, and his voice went quiet, he's trying to get around to where he thinks Whiskey 1 is shooting from. The radio went silent for a second that felt much longer than a second. Emily's voice when it came was still calm. It was a different kind of calm now, though. Even Holt listening in the TOC could hear it. The calm before was the calm of a hunter. This calm was something more concentrated. The calm of someone who understood that the game had fundamentally changed and was making adjustments without flinching. He's coming for me, she said, simply, as a statement of fact. Whiskey 1, can you relocate? Holt asked. A pause. If I relocate, I lose my angle on Alpha's position. He knows that. That's why he's moving north. Another pause. He's smart. Emily. I know, I'm thinking. Holt pressed his lips together. He wanted to say something useful and couldn't find anything useful to say, which was its own kind of helplessness. He was 20 kilometers away in a building with maps and radios and intelligence feeds, and a woman he'd sent up a mountain alone was now being hunted by a man who had spent his entire career learning exactly how to hunt people like her. Talk to me, he said finally, not as a commander, as something closer to a human being. He's wounded, Emily said, which means he can't move as fast as he wants to. He's also angry, and angry people make mistakes. But he knows this mountain better than I do, and he has a .50 caliber rifle, and if he gets within 600 meters of me, he doesn't need to be precise. He just needs to be close. A .50 caliber. Holt looked at Webb. Webb was already nodding. At that range, Webb said quietly, the bullet's bigger than some of the rocks she's hiding behind. So what do we do? Holt asked. We let her think, Webb said. In the rocks of Alpha's position, Okafor was doing his own thinking. He was thinking about a woman 3 kilometers away with a wounded, enraged enemy moving toward her, and he was thinking about what he could do from where he was, and the honest answer was almost nothing. He was pinned. His team was pinned. 3 of his people were hurt. He didn't have a line of sight on the north approach, and he didn't have a safe route to establish one. But he had a radio. Whiskey 1, he said on the direct frequency, just the 2 of them. Emily. He used her name deliberately, the same way Holt had, because there were moments when call signs created distance that wasn't helpful. Go ahead, she said. We're not going anywhere. You understand that, whatever happens on that ridge, we are here. We are not leaving this position and leaving you up there alone. A pause. That's not, you don't have to say that. I know I don't have to. I'm saying it. Another pause longer. And in that pause, something moved across the frequency that wasn't words. An acknowledgement. A moment of 2 people on opposite sides of an impossible situation, recognizing each other as human beings rather than just operators. Copy, she said finally. Keep Reyes warm. His blood pressure is going to drop again in about 20 minutes from the cold. Torres needs to check his tourniquet. Okafor relayed this immediately. Torres, who had been monitoring Reyes, continuously paused for just a second when he heard it. Then he reached for the tourniquet. She's right, Torres said to no one in particular. How is she right about this from 3 kilometers? No one answered because no one had a satisfying answer. Daniels had the best attempt. Some people just see everything. On the ridgeline, Emily had made her decision. She was not going to relocate, not because she was stubborn, not because she was reckless, not because she had any kind of death wish, but because she had done the mathematics of the situation with the same clarity she brought to every calculation, and the mathematics told her that relocating cost her the angle on Alpha's position, which meant that if the enemy commander circled back or had a fourth position she didn't know about, and she had to account for that possibility. Always account for the possibility you hadn't considered Alpha Platoon would be exposed. She was not willing to accept that. What she was willing to do was make the terrain work for her instead of against her. She had been in her current position for hours. She knew every rock within 30 meters. She knew the angles, the cover, the shadows. She knew the one place on the north approach where a man moving along the ridgeline base would have to briefly expose himself, and she knew how long the exposure would last. She had clocked it earlier during her initial survey out of habit, because surveying approach routes was something she did automatically and had done so many times that it required no conscious effort. The exposure was approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds at a range that would be closing given his movement to somewhere between 800 and 1,000 meters by the time he reached that point. 2 seconds. In good conditions, she could make that shot in her sleep. In these conditions, with wind, with a wounded target, who would be moving irregularly because of his injury, with her own elevated heart rate from the adrenaline she was managing, with the psychological weight of knowing that if she missed, he would know exactly where she was. In these conditions, 2 seconds was not comfortable, but it was enough. TOC, she said, I need you to tell me the moment you get any update on his movement from 2-6. Copy Whiskey 1, Webb is watching. Aaron Webb 2-6 was indeed watching. He had his night vision up, and he was tracking the blood trail, which was faint but present, and he was calling out position updates every 30 seconds in the quiet, steady cadence of someone who understood that the information he was providing was load-bearing. Moving north, pace is slow, irregular. He's favoring his left side, 15 meters from the base of the northern ridgeline approach. Holt relayed it. Emily acknowledged it. 10 meters. Emily settled her breathing. 5. She put her eye to the scope. He's at the approach, moving into the weight. He stopped. Emily froze. He had stopped. A wounded, experienced sniper commander had stopped at the edge of his exposure point, which meant one of two things. Either the pain had caught up with him, and he needed a moment, or he had anticipated the exposure and was waiting, trying to force her to act, trying to make her impatient. He knows, Emily said softly. What? Holt asked. He knows I have an angle on that approach. He stopped before the exposure. He's testing me. So what do you do? She thought about it. Not long, 15 seconds maybe. I wait longer than he does, she said. The silence that followed that statement on the radio was the kind of silence that meant everyone listening had understood something important. In the TOC, Holt sat down in a chair for the first time all night. Webb stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Both of them were listening to the open radio frequency, to the sound of Emily Carter and an enemy sniper commander playing a waiting game 3 kilometers away in the cold and the dark, each of them trying to outlast the other, each of them knowing that the first one to move would give the other what they needed. 2 minutes passed. 3. On Alpha's frequency, Mendes said something quiet to Daniels that Okafor caught the edge of. Something about how he couldn't feel his left hand. Okafor told him to keep it pressed against his body heat. Mendes said copy. Reyes had slipped into a deeper sleep, which Torres said was okay, which was probably true, but didn't feel great given everything else. 4 minutes. Aaron Webb said very quietly, he's still there. I've got weight. A pause. He moved backward. He went back 5 meters. He's sitting down. He's resting, Emily said. Is that good or bad? Holt asked. It means his wound is worse than I thought. He needs to stop. A pause. It also means he's not going anywhere for a few minutes, which means I have a window. A window for what? Emily didn't answer immediately. Holt had learned over the course of this night that her silences were not evasions. They were processing time. She answered when she had something worth saying. He knows my firing position. Or he thinks he does. He's been tracking my muzzle flash from the first 2 shots. He's going to try to put .50 caliber rounds into my position the moment he has line of sight. She paused. So I need to not be in my position. You said you couldn't relocate without losing the angle. I can't relocate far, but I can move 20 meters east along the ridge without losing Alpha's coverage. 20 meters is enough to put me outside whatever point he's zeroed on. Another pause. The problem is that 20 meters of movement on this ridgeline in the dark with him potentially watching, it's not zero risk. What's the risk? If he has thermal capability, he'll see me moving. And if he sees me moving while sitting down with a .50 caliber, she didn't finish that sentence. She didn't need to. Do you think he has thermal? Holt asked. The second position was using thermal camouflage. A team with that budget has thermal optics. Yes, I think he has it. Then how do you move without him seeing you? Emily was quiet for exactly long enough that Holt started to think she was going to say she couldn't. Then she said, I need a noise from Alpha's position. Something that pulls his attention south for 30 seconds. Not a weapon, something that sounds like an accident. Something that sounds like a hurt man who can't help himself. In the rocks, Okafor heard this through his earpiece and looked at his team. Mendez was already looking back at him, and despite the pain in his ribs, despite everything, Mendez was nodding. I can give you a yell, Mendez said quietly. Real one. I'll squeeze my ribs. Won't take much. Okafor looked at him for a long second. Copy, he said finally. On Whiskey One's mark. Torres started to say something. Okafor held up a hand. Torres closed his mouth. Emily's voice, Mark. Mendez squeezed. The sound he made was not performed. It was not theatrical. It was the specific, involuntary vocalization of a man with cracked ribs or compressing his own injury, and it carried across the mountain in the cold night air with the kind of authenticity that no amount of training could fake, because it was real, and the body does not lie about that kind of pain. Emily moved. 20 meters in 30 seconds on a ridgeline in the dark, moving as low and as fast as she could manage her rifle in her hands, her gear tight against her body. Every footfall placed with a care that was almost unconscious at this point, because this was the part of her training that had become cellular, had become part of how her body moved through the world. She made it. She pressed herself into her new position and went still and listened. No shot. He hadn't seen her. She exhaled, once completely controlled, and brought her scope up to her new angle. It was slightly degraded from her previous position. She'd expected that, but still workable. She could still cover Alpha's approach vectors. She could still do what she needed to do. And from here, she had a new angle on the northern approach that she hadn't had before. Whiskey One is set, she said. Copy, Holt said. Then because he couldn't help it, you good. I'm good. Tell Mendez I owe him. Mendez, who had heard this through the platoon net and was now pressed against his boulder, with tears running silently down his face from the pain he hadn't made a sound about since the ribs cracked, managed a rough, quiet laugh. Tell her we're even, he said. Aaron Webb's voice came in. He's moving again. He's up. He's moving east. Emily watched the northern approach. The enemy commander came into her field of view 40 seconds later. She saw him before she could confirm him, which meant she had what she needed, but not the certainty she wanted, and she gave herself 3 full seconds to acquire the confirmation, the weapon, the movement pattern, the size of the figure before she made any further decision. 3 seconds. Confirmed. She began her calculation. Moving target. Irregular pace. Wounded left side, which meant the right shoulder would be dropping slightly as he compensated for the injury. Wind had shifted again in the last 2 minutes. She'd been tracking it, always tracking it, coming slightly from the south now, which pushed her left. She adjusted. He moved into the exposure window. She was not ready. Not because she was slow, because the angle was still closing, and taking the shot at the far end of the window gave her a 2% better probability of a central hit, and 2% mattered enormously when everything else was already at the edge of the possible. He crossed the midpoint of the exposure. She fired. The crack of the shot rolled across the mountains. In the TOC, everyone stopped breathing. On Alpha's frequency, absolute silence. Then Aaron Webb said in a voice that was very careful and very controlled, He's down. He didn't get up. He's down. Holt stood up. He stood up and he put both hands on the table and he closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and then he opened them and looked at the radio. Whiskey One, confirm. Emily's voice was the same as it had been at the start of all of this. Quiet, level. The voice of someone who was still doing their job, still scanning, still watching, still not ready to call, It finished until she was absolutely certain. I need 30 seconds to confirm the position is cleared. Copy. 30 seconds passed. They passed very slowly. At the 28-second mark, Reyes made a sound in his sleep. Torres put his hand on Reyes's shoulder without looking away from the approach he was watching. At 30 seconds exactly, Emily Carter transmitted. And what she said, the specific words, the tone, the weight of what was behind them, was something that everyone who heard it that night would carry with them for the rest of their careers. Not because the words were beautiful, not because they were dramatic, because they were so simple and they were so earned. And they came out of something so real that they cut right through every layer of professionalism and training and operational distance and landed somewhere that those things didn't protect. She said, "The ridge is clear. I need a medevac for your wounded. Tell Reyes to hang on." And then after a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds, she said one more thing. "Tell them all they did good." Okafor held the radio for a moment without transmitting. Torres had both hands pressed flat against Reyes's chest and was looking at the sky. Daniels was completely still. Mendez was breathing slowly and deliberately, managing his pain doing the job. Aaron Webb had his night vision down and was watching the now quiet North approach, and his face was doing something that he would have been deeply embarrassed about if anyone could see it clearly. Okafor finally keyed the transmit button. "Copy, Whiskey 1. His voice was steady. It was the voice of a platoon commander who had held 17 years of composure through things that would have unraveled a lesser person, and he held it now right up until the very last word. They already know, every one of them. The medevac request went in at 0341 hours. Holt transmitted it personally, which was unusual because medevac coordination normally went through a dedicated channel with a dedicated operator who handled nothing else. But Holt had been at that radio for the last 2 hours, and he was not about to hand it off to someone else now. He stayed on the line, worked the weather assessment with the flight crew, argued calmly and persistently with the duty officer who kept citing ceiling restrictions, and finally got a commitment for a bird to be airborne within 18 minutes. 18 minutes. He relayed this to Alpha. Torres said copy and went back to monitoring Reyes, who was still stable, still breathing, still holding on with the particular stubbornness of a man who hadn't been told he had permission to do otherwise. In the TOC, the tension had shifted. Not gone, it never went, not until the last American was wheels up and heading home, but changed in character. The immediate crisis had a shape now. The ridgeline was clear. The wounded were being managed. The medevac was coming. These were knowable things, and knowable things, even hard ones, were easier to carry than the unknown. Captain Webb was running a post-engagement analysis on his screen, working backward through the suppression patterns, the shot timings, the positions, trying to reconstruct what had happened in a way that could be briefed, documented, understood. He kept stopping, starting over. Not because the data was unclear, but because every time he thought he had the full picture, he found another detail that made the picture more extraordinary. "Dennis," he said finally. Holt looked up. The third shot. Webb turned his screen so Holt could see it. The geometry on the third shot. "Look at the angle. Look at where she was. Look at where the target was when he entered the exposure window versus when she fired." Holt looked at the numbers. "She waited for him to close the distance," Holt said. "She waited for him to close the distance at a specific rate, at a specific point in his movement cycle, accounting for the fact that his wound was affecting his gait in a predictable way, accounting for a wind shift that happened approximately 90 seconds before she fired." Webb shook his head slowly. She was running a ballistic calculation in her head that most people would need a computer and a spotter and a full target profile to run, and she was doing it while managing her own position change, while monitoring Alpha's frequency, while being actively hunted. Holt was quiet for a moment. "When she gets back," he said, "I'm going to buy her a very good cup of coffee, and then I'm going to let her sleep for approximately 1 week." Webb almost smiled. On the ridge, Emily Carter was not sleeping, and she was not thinking about coffee. She was still in her position, still watching, still running the disciplined post-engagement protocol call that her training demanded, even when every instinct said the job was done. You cleared the area. You confirmed. You stayed ready. You did not allow the emotional weight of what had just happened to pull you out of the operational mindset until the operational mindset was no longer required. But she was human. And somewhere underneath the protocol, underneath the discipline, underneath the extraordinary calm that had carried her through the last several hours, something was happening. Something she didn't have a name for and wasn't going to examine closely right now. Something that felt like the specific bone-deep exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from caring enormously about an outcome and living through it. She had cared enormously about those men. She still did. The radio crackled. Okafor's voice. Whiskey 1, medevac is 18 minutes out. We're going to need to move Reyes to the extraction point. That means we're going to cross about 40 meters of open ground. A pause. I need you to tell me you still have eyes on the ridgeline. I have eyes on it, Emily said. Move when you're up, meet I'll cover you. Copy. And Emily, move your people, Commander. We can talk later. A brief pause that might have contained something like a quiet laugh. Moving, Okafor said. What happened next lasted approximately 6 minutes and felt like 6 hours. 6 minutes of Alpha Platoon crossing open ground with their wounded Torres, managing the movement of a man who couldn't walk under his own power. Mendez moving with cracked ribs and not making a sound about it. Daniels and Webb covering the approach. Okafor managing all of it simultaneously with the controlled urgency of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how much each second cost. Emily watched every second of it. She watched the ridgeline. She watched the approaches. She watched the angles. She watched the shadows. She held the scope to her eye without moving, without blinking more than she had to, until the last member of Alpha Platoon cleared the open ground and reached the covered extraction point. Alpha is set. Okafor transmitted. Emily exhaled. She let herself exhale, really exhale for the first time in what felt like a long time. But she did not lower her rifle, because something was wrong. She didn't know what it was yet. It was the kind of thing that lived below words, below conscious thought, the kind of signal that arrived as a physical sensation before the brain caught up and attached language to it. A tightness, a certainty without evidence, the feeling of being watched. She had felt this feeling before in training in the field, and every single time she had felt it, she had been right. Not because she was mystical or gifted with some supernatural awareness, but because the human nervous system, when properly trained, when kept quiet enough to hear itself, picked up information that the conscious mind hadn't processed yet. Micro changes in ambient sound, peripheral movement too small to identify, but not too small to register. Something was not right. She went completely still. TOC, she said very quietly. I need a status check on the third contact. I need you to tell me exactly where Web 26 last confirmed the position. Holt was on it immediately. Last confirmed position was approximately 200 meters north-northeast of your current location. 26 clocked it at 0336. He checked the time 5 minutes ago. 5 minutes. A wounded man moving north with a .50 caliber rifle. 5 minutes was a long time. He could have covered 60 meters in 5 minutes, Emily said, even wounded. Copy. Holt's voice had changed, and the brief moment of relief that had crept into it over the last 10 minutes was gone. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Emily said carefully, that I confirmed him down, but I did not confirm him out. There's a difference. There was a silence on the TOC end that lasted about 2 full seconds. Then Captain Webb said something under his breath that Garza, the radio operator, would later describe as not suitable for the official report. He was down but not out. This was the twist that no one had allowed themselves to consider because the confirmation had felt solid, because 2-6 had watched him go down, because after everything that had happened, the mind wanted to accept the good news and hold on to it. The enemy commander had gone down. He had not gotten up. These were facts. What was not a confirmed fact was that he had stayed down. A man with a severe enough will and a severe enough reason could get up from almost anything for almost long enough. Emily was already scanning. Not the ridgeline, not the northern approach, but the ground between her current position and where she calculated he could have reached in the last 5 minutes if he had recovered enough to move. She was thinking like him, thinking about what she would do if she were him, wounded, having watched 2 of her people go down, knowing the American sniper was somewhere in the eastern ridgeline position, needing to make this count. What would she do? She would not come from the north. The north approach was burned. He knew she had that angle. She would not come from the west. Too much open ground and wounded, that was too much exposure. She would come from below. She would come up the eastern slope below her current line of sight, using the terrain to shield her movement until she was close enough that the distance was no longer her problem. Emily moved her scope down. She almost missed it. Almost. A shape in the rocks below the ridgeline, approximately 140 meters down the eastern slope. Not moving. Absolutely completely still. The kind of stillness that wasn't natural. The kind that was performed. Her heart rate, which had been controlled and level and deliberate for the last several hours, jumped. Once. A single hard beat. He was already close. Far too close. He had not been hunting from a distance anymore. He had closed the ground while she was managing the medevac coordination, while Alpha was moving, while her attention was divided, not fully divided, never fully divided, but divided enough that a professional with the right intent and the right desperation could have used those minutes to cover ground. She could not take a shot from her current position. The angle was wrong. The rock formation between her and his position would deflect anything she put toward it, and at 140 meters, with a .50 caliber rifle on his side, a miss that gave away her location was not a mistake she could survive. She had approximately 30 seconds to make a decision. She keyed her radio. Her voice was controlled, not calm in the way it had been before. The calm before had been the calm of a hunter with options. This was the calm of someone who understood that the situation had fundamentally changed and that managing her own fear was now a combat requirement. TOC, I have eyes on target 3. He is alive and he is 140 meters below my position on the eastern slope. I cannot engage from current position. I need you to know this in case comms go dark. The silence on Holt's end lasted 1 second. Copy, Emily. What do you need? Nothing you can give me right now. A pause. Keep the medevac on track for Alpha. Don't redirect anything on my account. Emily. That's an order, Dennis. She never called him Dennis. He was TOC or Holt or Sir in some contexts. Not Dennis. Keep that medevac going. Reyes needs it. Holt opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Webb. Webb looked at the screen. She's right, Webb said quietly. Redirecting anything to her position at this distance in this time frame, with Alpha still on the ground, it doesn't work. She knows it doesn't work. He paused. She's on her own. Holt sat with that for a moment. Then he picked up the radio. You come back, he said. Just that. On the ridgeline, Emily heard it. She didn't respond. She was already working. She had her M4 in her hands. She'd set the sniper rifle aside because at 140 meters and closing in the terrain, she was in a carbine was what she needed. She had her sidearm. She had whatever was in her kit. She had her brain, and she had something else. She had been watching this man for the last 2 hours. She had been inside his decision-making for 2 hours. She had watched him adapt, reposition, compensate, problem solve. She knew how he thought. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to make a reasonable prediction about his next move. He was a sniper commander. He had been doing this for years. He thought in terms of patience and precision and the gradual elimination of uncertainty before commitment. He was not going to rush up that slope and assault her position directly. That was not how people like him operated. He was going to create a condition that forced her to move. He was going to make her ridge position untenable and then pick her up when she ran, which meant he was going to use the .50 caliber to take apart whatever cover she was in until there was no cover left, which meant she had a window right now before he settled and acquired and fired a window that existed only because he believed he still had time to be deliberate, believed she didn't know exactly where he was. She abandoned her position, not running, moving. Controlled low fast, using every piece of terrain between her and the edge of the ridgeline, heading not away from him, but toward a position 15 meters to her right that she had surveyed when she first established this hide, and filed away in the back of her mind as a secondary option under circumstances she hadn't fully defined yet. These circumstances. She reached the secondary position in 11 seconds. She pressed herself into it and did not move. 8 seconds later, the first .50 caliber round hit her original position. The sound was enormous, not like the crack of a rifle shot. Something deeper, something that hit the chest as much as the ears, a sound that said very clearly and very physically that whatever it touched was going to cease to exist in its own current form. Rock fragments erupted from the spot where she had been lying. The impact sent debris 30 meters in every direction. A second round followed the first, then a third. He was working the position methodically, systematically, taking it apart the way you took apart a building corner to corner, making sure nothing was left. 3 impacts. Then he stopped, because a disciplined sniper who had just expended 3.50 caliber rounds at a static position knew that the static position was either empty or already solved, and he needed to watch for movement before committing further. Emily did not move. She was 15 meters from where he was shooting. She was completely still. She was breathing through her mouth to minimize sound, her body pressed flat, her M4 in her hands with the safety off, and her finger indexed along the frame. She could not see him from here. She could hear him, the subtle shift of weight on rock, 40, maybe 50 meters below her. Now he had moved during his own firing. Smart. Fire, move, reacquire. The classic discipline. The radio in her earpiece was silent. She had turned the volume down to almost nothing. She could hear the faint sound of transmissions, but couldn't make out words. She didn't need words right now. Words were not going to help her right now. What was going to help her was the piece of paracord she was cutting from her kit with her knife and the ballistic helmet she had clipped into her ruck 2 hours ago when she'd moved to the secondary position, and the small signal panel that was standard kit, and that she had never once needed to use as anything other than what it was designed to be until right now. She worked fast. 30 seconds. She had a rudimentary but functional decoy. The helmet suspended on a length of paracord threaded around a rock, the signal panel attached to the side facing outward. Pull the paracord and the helmet would rise above the edge of the rock, visible for approximately 2 to 3 seconds before she released it and it dropped back. A fake target, a head, or what looked enough like a head to trigger the instinct, the trained instinct to fire. It was not sophisticated. It did not need to be. It needed to be sufficient to cause him to make one deliberate, committed shot, because a deliberate, committed shot meant he was acquiring a target, and acquiring a target meant he was oriented in a specific direction with his attention on a specific point, and that specific point was going to be 14 meters to her left, while she was positioned at her current location with a clear angle on the slope below her right. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, not from fear, to reset, to clear everything that had accumulated over the last several hours and arrive at this specific moment as clean and as present as she could be. She opened her eyes. She pulled the paracord. The helmet rose. The shot came almost immediately, and it was massive, and it hit the helmet and sent it spinning off the paracord in a completely different direction. And in the half second after the shot, the half second where he had committed to the trigger pull, where his scope was on the dummy target, where his body was oriented, 14 meters to her left, Emily Carter leaned around the edge of her rock. She found him. She fired 3 times. The first round hit center mass. The second round caught him as he was already falling throat level. The third round hit the helmet he was wearing as he went down. He fell away from the ridgeline. The .50 caliber rifle clattered off the rocks and disappeared into the valley below, with a series of impacts that she could hear fading as it bounced further and further down. Then silence. The kind of silence that was different from all the silences that had come before it. Emily stayed behind her cover. She stayed there for a long time, not because she didn't know the outcome. She knew the outcome. She had put 3 rounds into a man at close range with an M4, and she knew what that meant. She stayed because the discipline required it. The discipline required her to hold position, to scan, to confirm, to not allow the emotional impact of what had just happened to make her sloppy in the moments after it. 2 minutes. She scanned. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound except the wind, which had finally settled into a consistent direction for the first time all night, as if the mountain itself had exhaled. She keyed her radio and turned the volume back up. The first thing she heard was Holt's voice, tight and controlled. "Whiskey 1. Whiskey 1, respond." "I'm here," she said. The silence on the other end of that lasted almost 3 full seconds. And in those 3 seconds, Emily understood something about Dennis Holt that she had not known before tonight. She understood that the professionalism and the operational composure and the 22 years of doing hard things without showing what they cost, she understood that those things were real and earned and genuine, and they also had a limit, and she had just found it. "Status," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "Target 3 is eliminated," she said. "I am uninjured. The ridgeline is clear." She paused. How's my medevac? Holt laughed, Ishao. It was a short sound rough at the edges, the laugh of a man who was releasing something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. Your medevac is 4 minutes out, he said. Copy. She looked out at the valley below, at the darkness, at the mountains that had been doing their level best to kill every American on them for the last several hours. Tell Alpha they can breathe. On Alpha's frequency, Okafor had been monitoring. The entire platoon had been monitoring, packed into their extraction point. Reyes on a litter, Torres kneeling beside him, everyone else watching the ridgeline and the sky and the radio simultaneously. When Emily's voice came through the words, the tone, the particular quality of a person who had just been through something enormous and was already immediately thinking about someone else's medevac instead of themselves, the reaction moved through the platoon like something physical. Daniels made a sound, not a word, a sound. Torres pressed his forehead briefly against Reyes' shoulder. Just for a second. Mendez said through his carefully managed breathing, "Is it over?" Aaron Webb, 2-6 Petty Officer, 2nd Class, a man who had been pressed against rocks with cracked ribs, watching his teammate bleed for the better part of 3 hours, Webb turned away from the group for approximately 15 seconds. When he turned back, his face was composed. "Yeah," he said, "it's over." Okafor heard the medevac before he saw it. The sound of rotors in the mountains at night was one of the most specific sounds in the world, the kind of sound that had a different meaning in a combat zone than it did anywhere else. Out here at this moment, it meant the world had remembered that these men existed and was coming to bring them home. He keyed the radio. "Whiskey 1, this is Alpha Actual. I need you to stay on that ridge until we are wheels up. Can you give me that?" Emily had already settled back into position, already had the scope up, already was watching the approach vectors for the extraction point, as if the last 20 minutes had not happened, as if she had not just survived a close quarters duel with a man twice her size, carrying a weapon that could remove a vehicle's engine block, as if she was simply doing her job, which was exactly what she was doing. "I've got you," she said. "Take care of your people." Okafor didn't respond immediately. He was watching the sky, watching the ridgeline, managing the extraction, doing the 17 things simultaneously that leading a platoon in contact required. But for one brief moment, standing in the cold, in the mountains in the dark, he let himself acknowledge what had happened on this night. Let himself hold it just for a second before he put it away in the place where operators put the things that were too large to carry openly. A woman he had never worked with 3 kilometers away, alone with a rifle and a radio, and something that he did not have a professional word for and would have to think about later. She had held the line. She had held it when everyone, including most of the people in the TOC and most of his own people, had believed the line was already broken. "Alpha Platoon, this is Actual," he said into the platoon net, his voice carrying the specific authority of a platoon commander who meant every single word. "Listen to me, we are going home. Every one of us." He paused, because somebody refused to let it go any other way. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. The medevac touched down 40 seconds later. And on the ridgeline, in the cold and the dark, Emily Carter kept her rifle trained on the valley below, until the rotors faded and the sound of the bird carrying her people away became something she could no longer hear. Only then did she lower the weapon. Only then did she let herself sit down. She sat on the cold rock in the silence, and she looked at the mountains, and she thought about Reyes, who she had never met and probably would, and Torres, who had noticed the tourniquet, and Mendez, who had used his broken ribs to buy her 30 seconds, and Aaron Webb, who had called positions in the dark for 2 hours with the steadiness of a man who understood that his voice was the thread everything else was hanging on. She thought about Okafor's voice saying her name. She thought about Holt saying, "You come back." She reached into her kit and found the water bottle and drank from it and looked at the sky, which was beginning, barely almost imperceptibly, to do the thing it did in the mountains before the actual dawn, not lighter yet, not brighter, but somehow less absolute in its darkness. As if the dark was beginning to remember that it was not permanent. She held that thought. She held it the way you held something that mattered. Then she secured her equipment, checked her radio, and began the careful, deliberate process of moving off the ridgeline and back toward the world, leaving the mountain to the silence it had always owned, taking with her only what she had brought. And what she had brought and what she carried back was the same thing it had always been. The certainty that every one of them deserved someone who would not stop. She had not stopped. The medevac landed at the forward operating base at 0419 hours. Reyes came off the bird first the way it always worked. The most critical burns Torres walking alongside the litter, with one hand on Reyes' shoulder and his kit still open, because he had not stopped working from the moment the tourniquet went on until the moment the surgical team met them at the landing pad and took over with the particular controlled urgency of people who did this specific thing and nothing else. Torres stepped back when they took him. He stepped back and stood there on the landing pad in the rotor wash with blood on both hands and blood on his kit and blood on the front of his jacket. And he watched them take Reyes through the doors, and he did not move for approximately 30 seconds. Mendez came up beside him, moving carefully, one hand pressed against his ribs, breathing in the short, deliberate rhythm he'd been using for the last 2 hours to manage the pain without making it anyone else's problem. "He's going to make it," Mendez said. Torres didn't answer immediately. "Yeah," he said finally. "He is. Because of you." Torres shook his head. "Because of a lot of people." He looked at his hands. "Because of somebody on a ridgeline who noticed a tourniquet was going to slip before I did." Mendez had nothing to add to that. He stood beside Torres on the landing pad, and they watched the doors, and neither of them said anything else, because sometimes the right response to something overwhelming was simply to stand in it together and let it be what it was. Okafor came off the bird last. He always came off last. It was not a rule anyone had written down. It was just who he was, and everyone who had ever served with him knew it without being told. He walked off the landing pad and found Holt waiting for him. They had served together for 11 years. They had been in 7 countries together. They had sat in hospitals together and stood at memorials together and celebrated things together that civilians would not have understood the significance of. They knew each other in the way that men who have survived things together know each other, which is a different kind of knowing than most people ever experience. Holt looked at Okafor for a long moment. Okafor looked back. "You look terrible," Holt said. "I feel worse," Okafor said. Holt handed him a thermos, coffee, hot, the specific coffee that someone in the TOC had made at some point during the night, not because anyone had asked for it, but because doing something with your hands when you couldn't do anything else was its own kind of coping. Okafor drank from it and didn't say anything. "She's coming in on the next bird," Holt said. 40 minutes out." Okafor nodded. "James?" Holt used his first name, which he almost never did, which meant they had stepped outside the framework for a moment. "What happened out there? I had the radio traffic. I had the position reports. I had Webb's updates. And I still don't. I'm not sure I fully understand what happened out there." Okafor was quiet for a long time. "She held the mountain," he said finally. "That's what happened. Everything we tried to do, every way we tried to move, they shut it down. And she held it, alone, in the dark, while they were hunting her." He paused. "I've been doing this for 17 years. I have worked with some of the best people in any military in the world. And I have never," he stopped. Started again. "I have never felt so certain that someone was not going to stop. Not because they couldn't, because they decided they wouldn't." Holt took that in. "She told me to keep the medevac on track," Holt said, "while she was being hunted by a .50 caliber. She told me not to redirect anything on her account." "Of course she did," Okafor said, like it was the only possible thing she would have said. Inside the base, the rest of Alpha Platoon was filtering through the debrief process. The initial medical checks, the equipment turn-in, the preliminary after-action that happened in the first hour because memory faded and details mattered, and the intelligence community needed information quickly. Daniel sat in a chair in the debrief room with a cup of coffee. He wasn't drinking. Staring at the wall, Webb Aaron, Webb 26, who had called positions for 2 hours with cracked ribs, was in the medical bay getting imaging done on his chest and had reportedly told the corpsman to hurry up because he wanted to be done before Carter landed. The corpsman had said the imaging took as long as it took. Webb had said he understood that, and could they please hurry. At 0451 hours, Reyes came out of surgery. The surgeon, a Navy doctor named Pakravan, who had been doing trauma surgery in combat zones for 6 years and whose face did not typically carry a great deal of visible emotion during or immediately after procedures, came out to the waiting area where Torres was sitting still in his field gear, still not having changed or cleaned up, sitting with both elbows on his knees and his head down, and told him that Reyes was going to keep the leg, that the vascular repair had been successful, that barring complications, he would be transferring to a higher level of care within 24 hours, and that the prognosis was genuinely good. Torres looked up. He looked at Pakravan for a moment. Then he looked at the floor. "Thank you," he said. His voice was steady, absolutely steady. Every bit of the professional composure of a senior SEAL medic who had managed a catastrophic wound in the field under fire and brought his patient to surgery alive. He held it together for exactly as long as it took Pakravan to nod and walk back through the doors. Then Torres put his face in his hands. He didn't make a sound. He sat there in his bloody gear in the waiting area of a surgical bay at a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan, and he put his face in his hands, and what moved through him in those moments was something that had no clean name and didn't need one. It was the specific grief that was not grief of a man who had spent hours holding the line between alive and not alive, who had succeeded, who was only now allowing himself to feel the full weight of how close the line had been. He sat like that for about 2 minutes. Then he stood up, took a breath, and went to find the rest of his platoon. At 0502 hours, the second bird came in. Emily came off it alone, which was how she had gone out, which felt appropriate in a way that wasn't really about symmetry. She had her rifle, her kit, her ruck. She looked to the eye of anyone who didn't know what to look for, like someone returning from a routine tasking. Her gear was squared away. Her movement was controlled. Her face was composed. Okafor was standing at the edge of the landing pad. He had not gone inside. He had stood at the edge of that landing pad for 40 minutes, drinking Holt's coffee, watching the sky, and when the rotors became audible, he had set the thermos down on a piece of equipment casing and straightened up and waited. Emily walked off the bird and crossed the landing pad and stopped in front of him. They looked at each other. She was 5'7". He was 6'2". She had blood out on her forehead from where rock debris had cut her during the .50 caliber impacts on her original position. She had not mentioned this on the radio. She had not mentioned it to anyone, and she would not mention it now unless someone asked. He had a bruise along his left jaw from where he had hit the rock when the first suppression fire started, which felt like approximately 3 years ago. "Commander," she said. "Lieutenant," he said, a pause. "Reyes is out of surgery," he said. "He's going to keep the leg." Something moved across Emily's face. Just briefly. Something that was relief and something else layered underneath it, the particular emotion of hearing good news that you had done everything in your power to make possible and finding that it had actually worked. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. "That's good. Torres wants to talk to you." "I'll find him." Another pause. Okafor looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he extended his hand. She shook it. That was all. No speech, no formal acknowledgement, just the handshake of two people who had been through something together and understood each other on the other side of it. "My people are going to want to thank you," he said. "They don't have to. They're going to anyway." She almost smiled. "Copy." Inside the base, the reunion that happened over the next 20 minutes was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things were often portrayed. It was quieter than that, more specific. It was Daniel standing up from his chair when Emily walked into the debrief room and saying simply, "There she is," in a tone of voice that contained more than those 3 words could technically hold. It was Webb appearing in the doorway, still in his medical bay gown, because he had insisted on coming out when someone told him Carter had landed, and the corpsman trailing after him with an expression of resigned professional defeat. It was Mendez who was the most physically straightforward of all of them, who simply walked up to Emily and looked at her and said, "Thank you for what you did for me. I know what you used those 30 seconds for, and I know what it cost you." Emily looked at him. "You gave me what I needed," she said. "That was all you." "We can disagree about that later," Mendez said. "When my ribs don't feel like someone parked a truck on them." She looked at his chest. "Did they image it?" "Yes." "How many?" 3 cracked, 1 fully fractured." She winced. It was a genuine wince, brief and specific, the reaction of someone who knew exactly what that felt like. "You carried that for 2 hours without saying anything. Seemed like the worst option was saying something and everybody stopping to look at me. That's extremely professional and also somewhat insane." "Welcome to Alpha Platoon," Daniel said from across the room. Torres appeared at 20 minutes past 5 in the morning, and when he found Emily, the interaction was the quietest one of all. He came up to her and looked at her And for a moment, neither of them said anything. And then Torres said very simply, "You told me to check the tourniquet from 3 kilometers away. You were running calculations on a moving target in the dark, and you still knew his pressure was going to drop from the cold." Emily looked at him. "I was monitoring your radio traffic." "I know, but you were thinking about him. While all of that was happening, you were thinking about him." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's the job," she said. Torres shook his head slightly, like he was about to say something and decided against it. Like whatever he was about to say was something he'd saved for a quieter moment in a quieter place. "Thank you for my patient," he said instead. "Thank you for keeping him," she said. At 0600 hours, Holt called the formal debrief. It was standard procedure. The after action required information from every person who had been part of the operation, while the details were still clear, while the sequence of events was still in order in everyone's minds. Holt ran it the way he ran everything methodically, thoroughly, with a calm that was not performed but was simply who he was. He went through the timeline, the initial contact, the loss of communication, the first suppression positions, the decision to reach out to Whiskey 1, the first shot, the second shot, the movement, the third contact, the engagement. He asked questions, specific detailed questions. He took notes, he recorded the session. And then he reached the part of the timeline that covered the engagement between Emily and the third contact, and he stopped asking questions, and he sat back and he looked at Emily. "Walk me through it," he said. "All of it, from the moment you realized he hadn't gone down hard." Emily walked him through it. She walked him through it in the flat, precise language of an after-action report objective, sequential technical. She described the calculation, the decision not to relocate, the decoy construction, the 3 shots. She described it as a series of tactical decisions made under specific conditions, which was accurate and complete and entirely true. When she finished, the room was quiet. Holt looked at her for a moment. "The helmet and the paracord," he said. "Yes, you built that in 30 seconds. 28 maybe. While a wounded sniper commander with a .50 caliber was 40 meters below you. Approximately 40. I couldn't confirm the exact distance." Holt sat with that for a moment. "Okay," he said. Then he looked around the room, at Okafor, at Torres, at Daniels, and Webb, and Mendez. "Does anyone have anything to add to what Lieutenant Carter described?" Webb raised his hand. He was still in the medical bay gown, which was increasingly incongruous with the seriousness of the room, but which no one mentioned. "Yes," he said. "I wanted on the record that she told Reyes to hang on, a man she had never met from 3 kilometers away who didn't know she existed. She told him to hang on." Holt looked at his notes. "That's already on the record," he said quietly. At 700 hours, the debrief ended, and people began doing what people did after operations that had gone wrong. And then they ate, or tried to. They found quiet corners. They called home. If they could get a line, they slept, if their body allowed it, which for most of them, it wouldn't for a while because the adrenaline took hours to clear even when everything was over. Emily found an empty corner of the operations building and sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her rifle across her knees, and she closed her eyes, not sleeping, just being still, just existing without having to do anything with that existence for a few minutes. She had been awake for 22 hours. She thought about the mountain. She thought about the sequence of it, not the way she described it in the debrief, clinical, tactical, but the way it had actually felt, the way the darkness had felt, the sound of the .50 caliber hitting her original position, the texture of the rock under her hands when she was cutting the paracord, the 3 shots, the silence after. She thought about what it meant that she was sitting here and not still up there. She thought about the margins, the extraordinary paper-thin margins of every decision that had to go right for all of them to be sitting in this building right now. Reyes's tourniquet, Mendez's ribs, the helmet she had clipped to her ruck out of habit 2 hours before she needed it, the wind shift that had given her the angle. All of it balanced on the edge of something all night, and now they were on this side of it. She was grateful for that, in a way that had no performance in it, no drama, just the quiet bedrock fact of gratitude. The twist that no one had fully processed yet, not Holt, not Webb, not even Okafor, arrived at 0742 hours. It arrived in the form of an intelligence report from the agency team that had been working the asset rescue since before Alpha had inserted. The report landed on Holt's desk and he read it once quickly, and then he read it again slowly, and then he set it down and stared at the ceiling for a moment before he picked up the report and walked to find Okafor. Okafor was in the mess eating something, doing it mechanically because his body needed fuel, and he understood that even when he didn't want to eat. He looked up when Holt came in. He read Holt's expression and set down his food. "What?" he said. Holt sat across from him and laid the report on the table. Okafor read it. His face went through several things. The third contact, the sniper commander, the man with the .50 caliber rifle, the man Emily had engaged in a close-quarters duel on the ridgeline, was not as they had assessed a local Taliban commander with regional training. The intelligence team had been working the identification since the first reports of the engagement, cross-referencing weapon signature, positioning methodology, tactical behavior patterns. He was a professional military trainer, formerly attached to a Foreign Special Operations Advisory Unit. He had been operating in the region for at least 18 months. He had trained the other two snipers personally. The coordination they had seen, the precision, the spacing, the thermal equipment, it was all his. He had built the trap that Alpha Platoon had walked into. He had designed it specifically to be inescapable, to be something that air assets couldn't fix, and QRF couldn't fix, and experience couldn't fix. He had been designed to be unstoppable. He had been designed to be precisely what every voice on that radio at the worst moment of the night had called him. Okafor set the report down. He looked at Holt. "Does she know?" he said. "Not yet. She needs to know." "I know." They found her in the corner of the operations building where she had been sitting for the last 40 minutes. She had not moved. Her eyes were still closed. When Holt crouched down beside her, she opened them immediately, which meant she hadn't been sleeping. Holt handed her the report without preamble. She read it. Her expression did not change dramatically. There was a shift, something in the eyes, something that was the specific adjustment a person made when they received information that retrospectively recontextualized something they had already survived. She read it twice the same way Holt had, and then she handed it back. "He was good," she said. "He was one of the best they'd seen," Holt said. She nodded slowly. "He made mistakes," she said. "So did you probably." "Yes, mine just cost less." She looked at the report in Holt's hand for a moment. "The thermal camouflage on position 2, she said. "That was his. He brought that in. He trained them to use it." "Yes. If he'd given position 2 better instructions about thermal discipline, I wouldn't have found them." "Probably not. He was meticulous about most things and not meticulous enough about that one thing." She said it without satisfaction, without any quality of victory in it. The way an engineer examined a structure, looking at where the integrity held and where it failed, understanding both with equal dispassion. "Emily." Holt looked at her carefully. "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider anything. "I will be," she said. "Right now I'm still running." She touched her temple briefly. "In here, I mean, it takes a while to stop." "I know. Ask me again in a week." He nodded. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The asset," she said, "the one Alpha was going in to extract. Did they get out?" "Yes," Holt said. "Confirmed extraction. They got out during the medevac window when the ridgeline went quiet. Your engagement created the window they needed." She absorbed this. "Good," she said. "That was the mission." She said it the way she said most things. Simply, without theater. Not minimizing it. It was not a small thing, a human life extracted from a place that wanted to end it, but placing it in its correct frame. That was the mission. Everything she had done was in service of them. The math worked. The outcome was what it was supposed to be. "James wants to put you in for a commendation," Holt said. "That's his choice to make. He says it's not a choice, it's an inevitability." She didn't say anything to that. "Half the platoon wants to write statements," Holt continued, "unsolicited. Tora has already submitted something. 2-6 Aaron Webb, his fittest statement was 4 pages long, which I think might be a record for a man his rank. Despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the weight of the night and the information in the report Holt was still holding, despite all of it, something moved across Emily Carter's face that was unmistakable. She almost laughed. 4 pages, she said. He had a lot to say. He was on a rock with cracked ribs for 2 hours calling positions in the dark. He's allowed to have a lot to say. She leaned her head back against the wall. Tell them they don't have to write anything, she said. I know what happened up there. They know what happened up there. That's enough. Holt looked at her for a long moment. You know, he said, most people after a night like this one would want something. Recognition, acknowledgement, something. Emily closed her eyes again. I got what I wanted, she said quietly. Everybody came home. Holt stood up. He stood there for a moment holding the intelligence report, looking down at a woman who had, over the course of a single night, done something that he would spend months trying to adequately describe in the language that official reports required, always falling slightly short because the official language didn't have a category for what she had been on that mountain. It had words for bravery. It had words for tactical excellence. It had words for valor and performance under pressure and extraordinary skill. It did not have a word for the specific quality that had held every person on that ridge alive through the darkest hours. The quality that looked like calm from the outside, but was something more specific than that on the inside. Something that had a cost, that was paid in full, that was worth every bit of what it cost. He didn't try to name it. He left her to her quiet corner and her well-earned stillness, and he went back to his desk and his reports and the 100 administrative things that had to happen now that the operational things were done. At 0900 hours, Torres was finally talked into going to sleep by 2 different people, which was 2 more than it usually took with anyone else, and which said something about the night he'd had. At 0912 hours, Daniels fell asleep in the debrief room with his coffee still in his hand, which was noted, documented, and photographed by Webb for reasons that were purely professional and completely unprofessional simultaneously. At 0931 hours, Aaron Webb, who had written 4 pages about a woman he had never met before that night and would not forget for the rest of his life, found the operations building corner where Emily was sitting and sat down on the floor beside her, keeping approximately 2 feet of respectful distance, and looked at the wall. She opened one eye. How are your ribs? She said. They feel like what they are, he said. You should be sleeping. Probably, he said. A pause. I wanted to say thank you, he said, in person, while I still had the nerve. She looked at him for a moment. You didn't need nerve for that, she said. Felt like I did. She closed her eye again. You're the one who held the position data all night, she said. Every time I needed to know where he was, you gave it to me. Clean, accurate, fast. Without that, I'm working blind. Webb was quiet for a moment. I didn't think about it that way, he said. You should. Another pause. We make a good team, he said finally. Emily thought about that for a moment. Yeah, she said, we do. And in that quiet, in the noise of a forward operating base beginning another day, in the space between what had happened and what came next, that was enough. 2 people who had been on opposite sides of the same mountain, doing the same work from different positions, finding out that the thread between them had held. It had held all night. It was still holding now. Emily slept for 6 hours. Not because 6 hours was enough. It was nowhere near enough. But at the 4-hour mark, she woke up with the specific alertness of someone whose nervous system had not yet received the message that the crisis was over, and she lay still for 2 hours, trying to convince her body that it was allowed to rest. And at the 6-hour mark, she gave up and got up and found coffee and sat with it in the early afternoon light and let the quiet do what quiet was supposed to do. The base had its own rhythm. It always did. Operations came and went, personnel rotated, the machinery of the mission ground forward, regardless of what any individual had been through the night before, because the mission did not pause for individuals, which was both its great strength and its particular indifference. Emily understood that indifference. She had made her peace with it years ago. What she had not made peace with yet, what was still working itself out in the hours after the night, was the specific weight of what the intelligence report had told her. The man on the ridge, his history, his training, what he had been built to do, and how close he had come to doing it. She sat with her coffee and she thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. He had been good. He had been better than good. He had designed a trap that was supposed to have no exit, and he had been right about almost everything. The spacing, the timing, the coordination, the use of thermal equipment, the decision to go mobile rather than static. Every single tactical choice he had made had been the right one. Almost everyone. The detail he had missed, the thermal discipline on position 2, the slight variance in the rock face temperature that she had caught, because she had been watching long enough and carefully enough, that detail was small. Operationally small. The kind of thing that in 9 out of 10 engagements would never matter. In this one, it had mattered completely. She thought about that. She thought about how many times in her career she had been the beneficiary of someone else's almost. How many times the margin had been that thin, and she hadn't known it until afterward if she knew it at all. She was still sitting with that thought when Torres appeared. He looked better than he had at 5 in the morning. He had slept, she could tell, and he had cleaned up, and he was moving with the particular deliberate energy of a man whose body was tired, but whose mind had decided that there was still work to do. He found her the way people had been finding her since she came off the bird, by asking around because the base was not large. And because everyone who had been part of the night seemed to be oriented toward each other in some quiet gravitational way. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything immediately. She waited. "I went and saw Reyes," he said. "How is he, Wham? Awake, groggy, asking questions he's not going to remember asking." Torres looked at his hands, which were clean now, which probably felt strange to him. He doesn't know what happened yet. I mean, he knows he got hit. He knows he was medevaced. He doesn't know the full picture. "He'll get the full picture," Emily said. "Yeah." Torres paused. He asked about his team. First thing when he was coherent enough to ask anything, he wanted to know if everyone made it. Emily looked at him. "I told him everyone made it," Torres said. And he closed his eyes, didn't say anything, just closed his eyes and breathed. He paused. You know what he said after that? "What?" He said, "Who held the ridge?" Something moved through Emily that was quiet and deep and had no clean name. "He felt it," Torres said. "Even under he felt that someone was holding it." That's what he said. He said it felt like someone was holding the whole mountain. Torres looked at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "I told him your name. I put him what you did. I know maybe that wasn't my call, but he asked, and I couldn't not tell him." "It's all right," Emily said. "He cried," Torres said simply. "He's a hard man and he cried. He said to tell you he's going to walk again, and when he does, the first thing he's going to do is find you and say it to your face." Emily looked at the table for a moment. She didn't say anything. Sometimes there was nothing to say because the words that existed were not adequate to the thing they were supposed to carry. "Okay," she said finally. Just that one word. Torres nodded. "Okay," he said back. At 1400 hours, Holt called Emily into his office and closed the door, which meant something different from a closed door at the TOC. The TOC door closed for operational security. This door closed because what was about to happen was between two people and not between two officers. Holt sat behind his desk and looked at her and didn't immediately say what he had called her in to say, which told her he was organizing it, which told her it mattered to him to say it correctly. "The commendation process has started," he said. "Okafor submitted formally at 1100. I co-signed it. You didn't have to co-sign it." "I know I didn't have to." He said it with a flatness that indicated the discussion of whether he had to was not a discussion he was interested in having. "The intelligence team finished their full workup on the third contact this morning." And Holt leaned forward slightly. 18 months, Emily. He had been operating in that valley for 18 months. In that time, he had been responsible for the deaths of 11 coalition personnel across 4 separate engagements, 6 American, 5 Allied forces. He paused. Every single engagement had the same signature. Superior positioning, coordinated suppression, no exit route for the targeted element. She processed this quietly. "He never lost one," Holt said. "Before last night, every element he engaged, he neutralized. Completely." The room was very still. 11 people, she said. Yes, she held that, not abstractly. She held the specific weight of 11 people who had families, who had teams who had died in the same mountains she had been on last night against the same methodology without the margin she had found. 11 people who had met the same trap and not found the exit. "The asset Alpha extracted," she said. "Do we know yet what they were carrying?" Holt's expression shifted, just slightly. "Yes," he said. "As of this morning, the asset had been embedded for 8 months. They had a full breakdown of the network that was running the sniper teams. Names, positions, training camps, funding roads. He paused. The intelligence team is calling it one of the most significant single-source intelligence packages they've received in this region in 3 years. Emily sat very still. So last night wasn't just Alpha Platoon, she said slowly. No, Holt said. It wasn't. She understood what he was saying without him saying it further. If the mission had failed, if the ridgeline had not been held, if Alpha had been destroyed in that kill zone, if the extraction had not happened in the window that her engagement had created, the asset would not have made it out. The package would not have made it out. The network would have continued operating. More traps, more engagements, more names on a list that already had 11 names too many. She had known the stakes were high. She had known it in the way you knew it when you were on the radio at 2 a.m. listening to men bleed. But knowing it operationally and knowing it in the full context of what the package contained were two different kinds of knowing. You're telling me this because you think I should know, she said. I'm telling you this because you do the job and you don't ask what it means beyond the immediate mission, Holt said, which is one of the things that makes you good at what you do. But sometimes the full picture matters. Sometimes the full picture is... He stopped. It's large, Emily. What last night accomplished is large. She nodded slowly. Then she said something that Holt had not expected. Does the training community know yet, she asked, about the engagement, the methodology, the way he structured the three-position coordination? Holt blinked. Not formally, he said. The after-action is going to take time to process through. It needs to go faster, she said. What he built out there is replicable. If that network ran training camps for 18 months, there are other teams out there that were trained the same way. The next element that goes into a valley like that needs to know what to look for before they're already taking fire. Holt looked at her. This was the thing about Emily Carter that he had known since the first time he'd read her file, that the night on the ridge had simply confirmed in the most direct possible way. She was not thinking about herself. She was not thinking about the commendation or the impact or the recognition or the weight of what she had just survived. She was thinking about the next person who would be standing where Alpha Platoon stood and whether that person would have what they needed to come home. I'll push it up the chain, he said. Push it hard, she said, please. He looked at her for another moment. You know, he said most people would take a few days before they started thinking about training the applications. Most people probably sleep better than I do, she said. He almost smiled. She stood up. Dennis, she said, using his name again, which she only did when something mattered. Yeah, thank you. For keeping the medevac on track. For not redirecting anything when I told you not to. She paused. Some people would have overridden that. You told me not to, he said simply. That's not why you didn't. You didn't because you trusted my read of the situation. He looked at her steadily. Yes, that mattered, she said. That mattered as much as anything else last night. Because if that medevac had been pulled to cover me, Reyes might not have made it to surgery in time. And then the whole thing, all of it would have meant something different. She held his gaze. So, thank you. Holt held her gaze for a long moment. Come back from the next one, he said. Working on it, she said. The twist that the base would talk about for weeks came at 1600 hours. And it did not come from the intelligence team, or from the command chain, or from any official channel. It came from Aaron Webb, Petty Officer 2nd Class, who had been medically grounded from field operations for a minimum of 6 weeks, pending rib healing, and who had used approximately 4 of those grounded hours to track down something that he then brought to Emily in the same operations building corner where they had talked that morning. He was carrying a piece of paper. He handed it to her without preamble. She looked at it. It was a printout of a radio log transcript. Specifically, it was the transcript of the TOC frequency from 0217 hours to 0419 hours, the full 2-hour window of the engagement. Someone in Signals had compiled it. The full record, every transmission, every call sign, every word. Emily read through it. She read through it the way she read everything carefully without skipping, giving each part its proper attention. She read through the first transmission, Alpha's desperate initial call. She read through Holt's measured responses. She read through her own transmissions, which sounded in transcript form, even more level than she remembered them being, which was slightly surreal. She read through Torres's updates on Reyes and Webb's position reports, and Okafor's quiet authority holding his platoon together in the dark. She got to approximately the 40-minute mark in the transcript. She stopped. She read the section again. Then she looked up at Webb. Who compiled this, she said. Garza, Webb said. The radio operator in the TOC. He did it on his own. No one asked him to. She looked at the transcript again. The section she had stopped on was a 30-second window during the engagement, a window during which, in the middle of everything else, the TOC frequency had carried two transmissions that were not tactical, not operational, not information-bearing in any functional sense. The first was Okafor's voice at the moment when the .50 caliber had begun hitting her original position before she had transmitted her status in the 30-second window when no one knew whether she was alive. He had said, "Whiskey 1, come in, Whiskey 1. He had said it 6 times, not frantically, not with the ragged edge of panic, with the controlled, steady repetition of a man who was refusing to accept an alternative, who was transmitting into what might have been silence, because the alternative, not transmitting, accepting the silence, was not something he was going to do. The second transmission was Holt's voice 7 seconds later, overlapping the 5th repetition of Okafor's call. Holt had said, very quietly, so quietly that the transcript noted it as barely audible, "Come on." Just that. Come on. Emily sat with this for a long moment. She had not heard those transmissions in real time. She had been moving, had the volume down to almost nothing, had been focused entirely on the immediate physics of keeping herself alive. She had missed them completely. She had not known that Okafor had transmitted her call sign 6 times into potential silence. She had not known that Holt, the most composed man she had ever worked with, had said, "Come on," into a radio while he waited to find out whether she was breathing. She folded the transcript carefully and put it in her kit pocket. "Tell Garza thank you," she said. Webb nodded. "He said to tell you," and I'm quoting, "that he's been doing radio operations for 7 years, and he has never in his life heard anything like what came across that frequency last night. And he wanted you to have the record of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know something," she said to Webb, "about those 2 hours, the position reports. Every 30 seconds, every time I needed to know where he was, I asked, and you had it. Clean data, accurate, fast delivered with 0 wasted words." She paused. "I have worked with spotters who trained for years to do exactly that, and none of them were better than you were last night, under the conditions you were under." Webb's expression did not perform humility. It received what she was saying with the specific quietness of someone hearing something that landed. "I was terrified," he said, "the whole time. I want to be honest about that. I was completely terrified." "I know," she said. "It didn't affect your work. I almost called the wrong position once. About 90 minutes in, I caught it before I transmitted." He paused. "A wrong position call at that point in the engagement would have been bad," she said. "Yeah, but you caught it. Barely. Barely counts," she said. "Barely is the job." He looked at her. "Barely is the job," he repeated, like he was filing it somewhere. At 1800 hours, Okafor gathered Alpha Platoon in the briefing room. Not for a formal debrief that was done, not for an operational update, they were stood down. He gathered them because they were his platoon, and they had been through something together, and they deserved a moment that belonged to them. Emily had not been invited because it was a platoon moment, and she was not of the platoon. She was invited anyway. Okafor came and found her himself. He knocked on the door frame of the corner she had been occupying on and off all day, which was unusual enough to be notable given that knocking on a door frame when there was no door was largely symbolic, and symbolic gestures from Okafor meant something. "We're gathering," he said. "The team wants you there." She looked at him. "James?" "I know what you're going to say," he said. "It's their moment. You're not part of the platoon. It's not your place." He paused. "They disagree." She held his gaze. "Torres is going to talk," he said. "He has something he wants to say, and he wants to say it to everyone at once. Reyes sent a message from the hospital. Webb is going to read it." She closed her eyes briefly. "All right," she said. The gathering was quiet the way real things were quiet. Not solemn in a performed way. Just real. 12 people, most of whom had been awake for the better part of 30 hours, sitting in a room present with each other in the specific way that only came from having been in something together that mattered. Torres stood up. He was not a man who made speeches. He was a man who assessed wounds and made decisions and communicated the critical information as efficiently as possible. He was not built for the long form. He stood up and looked at the room. Reyes is going to walk, he said. He's going to have a scar and probably some weather sense in that leg for the rest of his life, and he's going to walk. He paused. That's not a given. At the point I was working him on that hillside, that was not a given. He stopped again, longer this time. I have been a medic for 9 years. I know what I'm doing in the field. And there was a moment last night, there was a specific moment where I was not sure, where the numbers were not going the right direction, and the situation was what it was, and I was doing everything I knew how to do, and it might not have been enough. The room was completely silent. And then a voice came across the radio, Torres said. A voice I had never heard before, 3 kilometers away, in the middle of an active engagement, and she told me to check the tourniquet. He paused. She was right. It was slipping. I caught it because she told me. 30 seconds later, and the outcome for Reyes is different. He looked at Emily directly. I have been trying to find the right words for that all day, and I don't think the right words exist. So I'm just going to say, you were thinking about my patient when you had every reason in the world to be thinking only about yourself. And because of that, my patient is alive. He sat down. No one spoke for a moment. Then Webb pulled out a piece of paper. Reyes dictated this to the duty nurse at 1300 hours, he said. She wrote it down because he asked her to. He said to read it to everyone. Webb cleared his throat. He read, "Tell my team I'm sorry I went down. Tell Carter I felt her up there. I didn't know who it was. I just knew someone was holding the mountain, and I decided to keep breathing until they were done. Tell her it worked. I'm still here. I'll see all of you on the other side of this. Don't do anything stupid while I'm gone." The room let that land. Daniels made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. Mendez had his eyes on the ceiling. Okafor was looking at his hands. Emily was looking at the floor, and the expression on her face was the most unguarded anyone had seen it since she had come off the bird that morning, because she was not performing anything in this room, was not managing anything, was simply in it, with these people feeling what it felt like to be in it with them. What it felt like was enormous. What it felt like was the reason she did this work. Not the tactics, not the skill, not the professional satisfaction of a well-executed engagement. The reason was in this room. 12 people who had gotten home. A nurse writing down a message from a man in a hospital bed who wanted his team to know he was still breathing. That was the reason. It had always been the reason. And then something happened that no one had anticipated, that was not planned or organized or officially sanctioned, and that would be quietly and permanently part of the story of that night for everyone who was in that room. Aaron Webb, petty officer, 2nd class, 26 years old, cracked ribs and all stood up. He stood up and he looked at Emily Carter and he started clapping. Not performatively, not for the room. He stood up and clapped the way you clapped when you had nothing left that was adequate, and the only thing your body knew how to do with what it was feeling was to make sound. Daniels was on his feet in the same second. Then Mendez, carefully, one hand pressed against his ribs. Then Torres. Then every person in that room. Okafor stood last. He stood and he looked at Emily and he clapped with the steady, deliberate cadence of a man who had 17 years of knowing what excellence looked like and was looking at it right now and wanted her to know that he knew. Emily sat in the middle of it. She did not stand. She did not raise her hand. She did not perform the gracious acceptance that the moment might have invited. She sat in the middle of these people who were standing for her, and she let herself feel it. All of it, every bit of what that room contained. She did not put it away or manage it or hold it at a professional distance. She let it in. And her face did the thing that faces do when something true arrives. It did not compose itself into an expression. It simply showed what was there. Gratitude, the specific gratitude of someone who had given everything they had for a group of people and was finding out that they had known it and felt it and were saying so. She held that for a long time. That night at 2100 hours, Holt sat down with the after-action documentation and began the formal write-up that would travel up the chain of command and eventually reach people in offices far from any mountain who would read it and understand some of it and not fully understand the rest of it because some things did not translate into formal language. He wrote the timeline. He wrote the positions. He wrote the confirmed engagements and the tactical decisions in the sequence of events. And then he got to the section where the documentation required an assessment of the factors that had contributed to the successful outcome, and he sat for a moment looking at the blank space. Then he wrote, "Successful outcome attributable to superior tactical positioning, technical proficiency under fire, and the decision to prioritize the welfare of the engaged element over individual force protection at each critical decision point." He stopped, looked at what he had written. Then he added one more line, which was not standard language, which no one had told him to include, which was simply accurate. The engaged element survived because one person refused to stop believing they deserved to. He left it in. Weeks later, when the engagement began moving through the training community, exactly as Emily had pushed for, faster than such things usually move, because the intelligence on the network made the urgency undeniable, the after-action became a case study. It was analyzed and discussed and broken down in the specific, methodical way that the training community broke down engagements that had something to teach. The tactical lessons were real and useful. The three-position coordination, the thermal camouflage variance, the behavior of the mobile element, the value of the decoy in a close-quarters engagement. Young operators absorbed these things and filed them and carried them forward. But there was something else, something that came up in every discussion of the case study in every room where it was taught, that was harder to quantify and impossible to put in a training checklist. The instructors who taught it called it different things: composure, mental discipline, the refusal to accept a frame that told you the situation was over, the specific quality of a person who, when everyone around them had already decided the outcome, decided something different. One instructor, a retired senior chief who had been in the community for 20 years and who was not known for sentimentality, put it this way to a room full of SEAL candidates who were exhausted and cold, and several weeks from finding out whether they had what was required. You're going to be in situations where everything around you is telling you it's done. The radio traffic, the numbers, the guys next to you, all of it is going to say it's over. And the question is not whether you feel that. You will feel it. The question is whether you let it become the decision. He paused. There was a woman on a ridgeline in eastern Afghanistan at 3 a.m. who heard the same thing you would have heard, and she made a different choice. Not because she didn't feel it, because she cared too much about the people on the other side of it to let that be the last thing. The candidates were quiet. "That's not something I can teach you," he said. "That's something you decide. Right now in this room, before you ever set foot on a real mountain. You decide whether the people next to you are worth that." Emily Carter never stood in front of a training class. She did not give speeches. She did not seek out the role of example or symbol or lesson. She continued doing her job with the same discipline and the same patience and the same refusal to measure the work by anything other than whether it accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish. But in the years after that night, in the rooms where the case study was taught, in the quiet conversations between operators who had studied what had happened on that mountain and tried to understand it, her name meant something specific. It meant the willingness to be the last person who believed when believing was the only thing that was still possible. It meant the choice to hold the mountain when the mountain wanted to take everything. Reyes walked again. He walked with a slight variation in his gait that his physical therapist noted and that he did not think about, because walking was walking and he was grateful for every step. He found Emily 6 months later, the way he had told Torres he would, and he said what he had said he would say, standing in front of her, looking at her directly the way you said things that mattered. She listened. She said, "I know. I'm glad you're here." He said, "So am I." And that was enough. Because the work was not done for the recognition or the gratitude or the memory of it, though all of those things were real and true and worth something, and the work was done because on a mountain in the dark, 11 names had not been enough, and 12 was not going to happen, and 13 was not going to happen, and every name on a list that didn't need to be there was a person who had mattered, and a team that had lost, and a line that had failed to hold. She had held the line. One sniper, one rifle, one decision made in the cold at the edge of what was possible. Skill defeats fear. Discipline defeats chaos. And one person who refuses to stop can change the outcome of everything. That is not a story about what she did that night. That is a story about who she decided to be before she ever got to the mountain. And on that ridge in the dark, with everything against her, that decision proved true. It always does.